Good evening and welcome to another episode of Across the Pond. Barry just pointed out it's lucky number 13.
13 is a great number. I don't know why everyone's got such a thing about it. It's a wonderful number. It's the day I was born on. So I'm excited for this one, Chad.
Let's get into it.
Pond, across the pond with Barry and Chad.
So, like Barry said, it's kind of the anniversary of his birth, which is incredible. Not quite, if you were to look at it in monthly terms. But yeah, Barry had a bit of concerns to try and get here tonight. Eskom's load shedding made it a little bit uncertain if he was actually going to be able to join us. But thankfully, he's here. So, Barry, welcome.
Thank you so much. That's part of the fun of podcasting in Joburg. You never know when you're going to have power. You never know how you're going to record these episodes. So I'm very happy that Eskom gave us some power back just in time for our recording, Chad. So excited to get into this one.
Just in time indeed. Well, let's get into it.
The week that was.
The first one in the week that was is talking about a topic that's come up again and again during our podcast so far, and that's the topic of facial recognition technology. Now, Chad, if you remember last week, we spoke about the EU potentially looking to ban the use of facial recognition for the next 5 years, and we talked about how it's quite a bold move to make and talked about some of the pros and cons about such a thing. And then this week, it comes out that London, who obviously have now left the EU and are part of the separate independent entity they call the UK, London have announced that they are going to start deploying facial recognition technology in some key areas in London, right? So they've taken some key targeted areas they think are at high risk for things like terrorist attacks and stabbings and robberies and those kinds of things, and they're going to deploy facial recognition technology to help police in those areas. So they came out of the statement saying they're going to start trialing this and experimenting with it and seeing how it works, and they made it very clear to say this isn't going to take the place of the police. It's just going to be a tool the police can use to find people they're looking for or to try and look for suspicious activity. So it's a very interesting move. It shows the difference between what the UK and the EU are now going to do. It's the first kind of diversion that I've seen when it comes to policy or when it comes to the use of technology. And so I think it's quite interesting. Chad, what do you think about this coming into your city there?
Yeah, I mean, like you say, I think it is interesting to see given the timelines. And, last Friday was the day. I think a lot of people expected a lot to change overnight and have been reminded very quickly that it's business as usual pretty much until essentially the next year runs out its course in terms of the negotiations that are going to take place. But yeah, certainly, we always speak about facial recognition and privacy. And kind of similar to last week's episode, I'm always keen to know the sort of specifics of this. So is this going to be a sort of central camera service where there is a specific algorithm or specific piece of software that allows government to access this? Or is this actually allowing more private people to have facial recognition in their stores, for instance?
I think this is specifically targeted towards the government's use of it. So the government's going to have a system they use around certain public areas, and they're going to have full control. So private citizens aren't going to be able to look at the data or use the technology or any of that kind of stuff. It's purely for the government and the police specifically to try and improve public safety in those areas that are considered high risk. And so as far as I understand, as a public citizen, you're not going to have much choice in this. Like your face is going to be recorded throughout these public areas, and then using the police data they have on record, they're going to start making insights and inferences and those kinds of things that are hopefully going to help them reduce crime and try and improve that safety. So I think that's kind of the way they're going, but this is very early days. I mean, this only came out a few days ago, and so we're waiting to see how it's going to be executed and what impact it's going to have on things like subway stations, on train stations, on public courtyards and places and those sorts of things.
Well, I think that's the key thing, and to sort of answer your question of how I feel about it, to be honest, I'm not too fussed. I mean, as soon as we leave the boundaries of our front door, we're in the public domain, and for me, I think it's fair game. If it's going to make a society safer, if it's going to be in the right people's hands, if they're going to be used for the right purpose, I completely get that. Now that you mentioned it's going to be mainly for government sort of camera systems, there are loads of those. So you mentioned the subway system. Even if you consider the buses, throughout London's networks, each of these buses have, at least 10 cameras on board, and even pointing onto the street. So I certainly think it's going to be useful data, especially when we look at these terrorist attacks, and unfortunately we actually have one this week to report on. So yeah, I mean, I'm certainly not against it, and for once, I think it's good to see, London breaking away from the EU in this way. So yeah, that's my thoughts. What are your thoughts if this were to be in Johannesburg?
Yeah, I'm not sure what I think about this. We've been chatting about it for a few weeks, and I'm still unsure about the privacy versus safety conversation. Right? It certainly does feel like inevitable. I think that all cities are going to have this in the future. I find it hard to see a city that's going to hold off on this technology if it proves to be much safer as we expect it to be. Right? And especially somewhere like London, like you chat about the terrorist attack. I think we should tackle that next, even though it's further down on our list. Just because this kind of public safety has become so important in these urban dense areas. And a lot of these first world cities, the major crimes they're seeing are these kind of very public, very kind of dramatic type occurrences that really impact on the reputation of that city and kind of the morale and the feeling of the citizens, right? And so if the citizens have that feeling of extra safety, even if the numbers don't back it up, but if the cameras help to disincentivize some bad stuff or to help to keep people accountable for their behavior, I think we're going to see it rolled out in a lot of the major cities. Here in Joburg, of course, there's a huge crime problem, and so it's one of the biggest crime hub spots of the world.
Yep.
And so I think that it would be great here. The problem in Joburg is that our police are not nearly as effective as in London, right? So our police force is quite dilapidated and not as effective as we'd like it to be. And so whether all that data and information would actually help at all is hard to say, right? All of this data and all of this machine learning and AI in these systems, all it does is gives the police more tools to do their job.
Yeah.
They still have to be good at what they do.
Definitely.
They still have to be able to take action. They have to be able to have judgment, professional judgment, skepticism, etc., so they can do their job well. So this is not a replacement, or it's not going to take the place of traditional law enforcement.
Sure.
It's simply another tool that allows them to scale their influence and basically have eyes everywhere. Instead of just having guys patrolling areas and hoping they are walking past at the right time, you can have eyes everywhere and then reallocate your resources to those emergency spaces where needed.
Definitely. I mean, it's an interesting conversation. And to be completely honest, the last time I was in Johannesburg, I did notice at almost every sort of main intersection, there is now a pole that has CCTV cameras on it. Now, I don't know where that's feeding into. I don't know, as you say, how well it's actually going to be used. But yeah, I mean, I certainly think that's quite an interesting one. Do you know offhand who those cameras belong to?
Yeah, so those cameras are actually belonging to all the various private security organizations and companies who operate in the various areas. So the major disadvantage of that is that data is not shared with everybody, right?
Yep.
So say, example, a security company like ADT might have certain areas they're looking after, and they'll have the data for those areas, but the moment a person leaves that neighborhood, they all of a sudden are completely dark. And so the benefit of having the government, which has full surveillance and can see all the data, is that you unlock a lot of the insights that come with trying to locate someone.
Sure.
In Johannesburg, these security companies are putting up these cameras to try and keep residents happy and try and give some sort of recourse if something goes wrong. But when it comes to live, like in person at that time, dealing with situations, it's not as helpful, because the moment the guy gets out of those 3 or 4 streets, all of a sudden you can't track him anymore.
Definitely. Well, like you said, let's move on to the next one, which is basically another terrorist attack that happened in London. This happened this past weekend. Again, we were kind of just at home and got this push notification from the BBC service to say that an attack happened in Streatham. As far as I understand, there were 3 injuries to civilians. One immediately was seen as life-threatening, but since we've heard that it is not life-threatening, which is great. So no ordinary civilians have had any sort of severities there, which is fantastic. But again, this raises the question about terrorism and jail sentences and those kinds of things. So this person was a 20-year-old male who had been recently released from prison for an Islamist-related terrorist sentence. He was halfway through the sentence and he was released to a bail hostel. I believe the government saw there was extra risk in releasing this person and had actually assigned police people in civilian uniform to completely have 100% watch over his movements at all times. And this is exactly why within 10 seconds of the strikes happening, he was shot dead effectively. So again, it's another case where I think a lot of people are calling on these regulations in terms of the prison sentences and this leeway for an automatic release of prisoners halfway through for terrorist-related incidents. But then on the other side, people saying, well, if you remove that, it ultimately is just essentially delaying the inevitable. And the sort of key problem actually potentially being that there is no real rehabilitation of the extremists within prison, and that's why people saying it is essentially delaying the inevitable. What do you think?
I think it's hard with these kind of cases because how do you rehabilitate someone if their reason for doing what they're doing is ideological, right? So if the reason they're doing it is because of some sort of idea of what an afterlife looks like or a religious idea of what I should be doing in this world, just because you put me in jail for 10 or 20 years, that might not necessarily change my views or change the kind of the dogma that I've grown up with. And so the real question here is a difficult one, is rehabilitation possible of these kinds of people? Like this guy is 20 years old, so his brain hasn't developed fully. He's still kind of living with the background and upbringing that he's been brought up with. He hasn't had the chance to think for himself or check out his views and his opinions for himself. And so what kind of rehabilitation are you going to do if he believes this is the way to heaven, if he believes this is the way to get to paradise? So with a lot of these ideological terror attacks, it's hard to know what to do because you want to give them the benefit of the doubt. You want to think that your normal system of law and your system of punishment is going to do what's necessary to change that person's view and kind of make them a more empathetic individual and kind of stop him from doing things in the future. But we've seen time and time again that this doesn't always work out like that. So it's a very challenging one because I think we have to think differently about our traditional law when we're thinking about these ideological crimes as opposed to a crime of hate or of passion or of just kind of, psychopathy.
100%. I mean, it almost needs to be done on a sort of case-by-case basis. I think it's really hard to put a blanket law in place that can catch all of these kinds of circumstances. So in terms of your point about his upbringing and that kind of thing, his mother actually spoke to the Evening Standard, which is a newspaper that I read actually on my way home today. And she was just basically talking about how he was a normal kid growing up and how essentially with the advent of the internet, he was recruited at that stage, that kind of leading into his first sentence. And then she said in prison, it escalated to another level. So I think here's another question of how within prison, there are potentially groups and factions there that are actually even boosting their own agenda. That's an interesting one.
Definitely, and that's a problem we've dealt with in prisons for a long time because we haven't really solved the problem of how to do mass incarceration, right? There's so many side effects that come with putting all of these people in the same place. Yeah. And we chatted before that you become like the 5 people you surround yourself with, right? The people that surround you influence the way you think, influence the way you act, and influence the person you become. Definitely. So if you go into prison as a young person in, say, your late teens, your early 20s, where you're still trying to figure out your identity, trying to figure out what you believe, and then you're surrounded by people who think that way, it's a no-brainer, right? You're going to be influenced to think like that. And so we haven't solved the whole mass incarceration thing yet as to how do we, like, economically and with enough kind of supervision, understand how we put all these people away in a similar spot, because you have to do that. You can't have separate, like, homes or separate prisons for everybody. And what does that do to people who are being rehabilitated or who are changing their views? It's a really, really difficult one.
Very difficult one indeed. But I mean, certainly at the way that it's currently being managed, surely is just not sustainable. You've got essentially taxpayers' money for private policemen to watch and walk around one single person, which is obviously not scalable, which is obviously not the way people want to live, knowing that there's somebody just sort of on the loose, legally speaking, but who is perceived to be high risk.
And it didn't even work. Right, even though you had those private policemen, it still didn't work because you still managed to carry out an attack. Yep. So it's a tough one.
Well, I mean, for anyone who's wondering how he managed to do that, I believe there was a low-cost shop, and he had essentially gone in there a few days before, essentially just looked around the shop to see what he could find. On the day of the attack, he actually walked in and picked up a knife, removed its packaging, and essentially started the attack. Essentially stole the knife, ran out of the store. He had a fake vest around his body, so very interesting to know where he got that from. But like you said, it didn't work, and ultimately something has to happen here to make some meaningful progress. So if we then move on to the next story, the ANC, the ruling party in South Africa, we actually literally spoke about this a few weeks ago, have essentially now allowed companies to produce their own electricity. Now, this for me seems like it should have come sooner, and I think it's a resounding sign of positivity and hope for South Africans, and especially for businesses who have been really struggling without electricity.
Yeah, it's been the topic when it comes to power for the last 4 or 5 years, and it's been coming for a long time, and it's so obvious now it needs to happen that they don't really have any other choice, right? So a lot of papers are trying to spin it that the ANC have actually made a proactive decision here and a choice. I don't think it is. I think they've realized that there's serious struggles with Eskom. Yeah. So for those who don't know, Eskom is a state-owned enterprise and has full control over the South African power grid, and up until now, you've not been able to create your own electricity and supply into that grid, or even kind of be off grid, because they've completely ring-fenced that utility. And what that has done is put all this pressure on Eskom, and then through all the corruption and the mismanagements and all the issues they've gone through, they haven't been able to match South Africa's electricity needs. And so we've had load shedding over the last couple of years. And kind of through pressure from the mining industry, who've been saying for a long time now, if load shedding continues on an extended basis, we will not be able to function. Like, imagine if you're running a mine, Chad, and for 20% or 30% of your mine's running time, you can't even use the equipment. 100%. So guys get stuck down in the mines. You can't actually do like fulfill your quotas. You can't actually keep a business running. And even in a very, very tough market, you got no chance. And so for the mining industry, which is so important to South Africa, it's like one of the core pieces of the South African economy, to stand up and say enough is enough. And like you said, the ANC have finally given up that battle and are willing to let private companies start to produce their own electricity. And this can only be good for the grid. That kind of market competition will hopefully provide more reliable electricity at hopefully a better cost, and just better customer service all around. So as a citizen, I'm very happy to hear this. Yep. I think it's a big kind of error from the ANC. It's taken this long, but at least it's happening now. And hopefully the next few years, we see a lot of competition in this space, which gives me the chance to get better electricity that is on all the time at a decent price.
Yeah, I mean, just the basics. I mean, like we said just before the call, who would think of living in a city with sort of 9-10 million people, in Greater Johannesburg, and electricity is just not a commodity that is reliable, which is very interesting. But yes, in terms of Eskom, we've seen sort of the new CEO speaking out about doing some back maintenance, which I think is definitely a positive step. Looking at all of these catastrophes that have happened in the last couple of months, owing to some poor maintenance. So good to see that. Also good to see a couple of convictions coming out in terms of the mismanagement, in terms of the funds mismanagement. And I believe he mentioned there may be a couple more arrests. This also kind of just throwing a bit of accountability for the actions of mismanagement and state capture.
It really makes me happy. It gives me a little bit of optimism, right? We've been speaking a lot about South Africa's negatives over the last couple of weeks, and this is a tiny green shoot, something that really shows that perhaps the tide is about to change. So I, for one, am very optimistic about this. I hope this is the start and the catalyst of a huge change to how South Africa thinks about their energy problem. And if we can solve that, it's a huge step towards reinvigorating the economy, reinvigorating investment kind of morale and kind of the way that South Africa is seen in the eyes of the rest of the world. And if we fix those problems and get electricity back and running as it should be, it's a good sign for us.
Definitely. I mean, especially for, overseas entities looking to invest. I think it's just one of those things that just has to be there. It's a prerequisite for any business taking place. So let's see what happens in the near future. Moving on to the next one. The British Academy Film Awards happened this week, the BAFTAs. We've basically seen a couple of the awards. So if we run through just a few of them, the best film going to 1917. I haven't watched it myself, but I believe the film effect and the fluency with which some of the scenes were shot is incredible. So that's great. Have you watched it, or are you thinking of going to see it?
I haven't, but everybody is talking about it, and so I'm very excited to go and see it. It seems like exactly the kind of film that I enjoy, and so I'm dying to see it, so I can't wait.
Fantastic. I mean, we also saw Renee Zellweger getting the leading actress award for her role as Judy Garland in the movie Judy. And to be completely honest, I feel quite happy about this. But I was actually in the audience of the Graham Norton show when she was basically on the show talking about this film that was to be released. Very cool.
That's awesome. That's awesome. What is the Graham Norton show like? I mean, I've always watched it on YouTube. What is it like being there in the audience? Is it strange?
For me, for somebody who loves film and production and just the whole sort of buzz about media, I thought it was absolutely fascinating. And for me, one of the coolest things I've done in London. It's completely free, which is awesome. So if ever you are this side, just sign up on one of the websites. I need to double think about what it is, but essentially it's a body that essentially manages the audiences for these shows, and you essentially put your name down and a couple of lists of potential dates that you could be keen on, and the week before they send you an email. So I thought it was really cool being in the room. Kind of got to see quite a few cool people, and so yeah, was a great experience, and I'd highly recommend to anyone who is passing through London if the season is going on at that time. Some of the other roles, we spoke about our awards for the year, and Barry mentioned Joker was his best film of the year. His favorite film of the year, shall we say? And the leading actor from that, Joaquin Phoenix. I don't know if I said that right, but from your side, I suppose that would be well deserved, Barry.
Definitely, I thought his performance was sterling, and I really enjoyed it. And I think he's going to kind of clean up a lot of the awards for this next kind of season based on the Joker performance. We have to wait to see what happens at the Oscars, of course. But what I thought was interesting about, I think we're getting to it slowly, Chad, is that a lot of the talk around the BAFTAs was a lack of diversity.
Definitely.
Right. So one of the major things that came out of this year's BAFTAs was the fact that I'm not sure if was it no people of color were even nominated. I don't think. Something crazy like that, where there was zero representation for people outside of the traditional kind of white audience. And so there was huge uproar, obviously, like rightly so, about the fact that there was no representation outside of the white population. And what I really enjoyed was Joaquin Phoenix's acceptance speech, where he kind of turned the mirror back on the Academy completely and made a very impassioned plea to everybody, talking about this lack of diversity and how he is part of the problem. So he kind of acknowledged his own privilege and the fact that he hasn't done everything in his power to ensure diversity on his sets, in his crews, with his cast members, etc. And it actually, one of the things that really stood out for me, something very powerful, he said that it's up to us as white people, as people who have been advantaged in the past, that we have to dismantle the systems of oppression that are holding back the rest of the world. And so we are the ones who have to fix this stuff, and we have to stand up and make our voices heard and change these traditional systems that are rewarding people in an unfair way. And so I thought it was a really cool speech and really powerful, very brave, of course, because it's like you're getting an award from this academy. And so big ups to him. I hope that things change as a result of this kind of uproar with this year's.
Definitely. I mean, I think something, as you said, really hard to miss when you see such a lineup like that in terms of nominations and then the final awards as well. A fact that I heard, the Oscars obviously coming up fairly soon as well. And one of the people of color, one of the ladies who was nominated there, who is British, didn't actually even get nominated for the BAFTAs, which is really interesting, and I completely agree with you there. I think it takes that courage for an actor who's receiving an award, who feels passionately about something, to actually voice his opinion, and not really worry too much about how people are going to react. It's kind of previously been seen as taboo to talk about things that are not politically correct or to things that could seem controversial. But I think it's important that he did that and shows certainly a lot of courage on his side. Very important indeed.
Yeah, definitely. We need a lot more from these kind of high iconic figures that we see in our mass media to really be the voices of the change we want to see, right? They have so much influence over so many people that if they're preaching the right messages and they're pushing for action on important topics, it can only be good for society. So the more we talk about this stuff, the more we can battle through the debates and battle through the challenges and fix what we've broken in the past.
Absolutely, 100%. Moving on to the next topic, which is a very important one, the coronavirus. Literally, as I'd finished editing the episode, I actually sent Barry a message with the updated stats. And at that time, it had doubled, tripled, which is absolutely crazy. As we stand now, no doubt this will be a different figure when this episode comes out. But, the numbers have increased as well. There's been 361 deaths. I actually just wanted to talk about the sort of financial implications of it for just a second. I think Barry will go a little bit more into what the deaths mean and that kind of thing. But obviously we saw the Chinese government extending the Lunar New Year holiday, and the financial markets opened essentially this past week, and we saw the equivalent of 300 billion pounds wiped off of the exchange, with shareholders just selling off shares. The government tried to put a whole bunch of cash into the company to try and kind of alleviate the effects of this, or at least anticipated the effects of this. But it had no clear benefit there. Don't you think that's fascinating?
Yeah, it's fascinating and to be expected, right? With this kind of worry and this kind of fear in the markets at the moment, a mass sell-off is to be expected. So the number is staggering. It's hard to even fathom that amount of money. It's hard to imagine that being wiped off of China's economy. And what I also found fascinating was that it wasn't just limited to China. All the Asian markets saw downturns, and even into Europe and the US, they also had impacts.
Definitely.
So it's a reminder of how interconnected our world is. And when a Chinese market goes through a huge crash like that, it impacts everybody around the world. And so it's a scary amount of money, and it's indicative of the amount of fear we're seeing in the world at the moment. There really is a risk of this becoming a real pandemic, and everyone is very, very worried about it. Obviously, the media is becoming a firestorm around it, and it calls for calm, clear leadership and a lot of work to make sure we contain this as best we can and limit the impacts both medically and financially on the world.
Yeah, 100%. I mean, just looking at the notes, Barry, you've written down that it's exceeded the SARS virus in terms of number of infections, but luckily with medical intervention, it doesn't look as deadly, which is certainly interesting. But when these conversations come about, people kind of try to reduce these alarmist sort of views and in comparing it to a virus like flu, which has a large number of infections and deaths per year. But this is certainly something to not just glance over, something bigger than SARS. Even though we've luckily been able to intercept the sort of death rate, it's still certainly very concerning.
Yeah, definitely. And the reason that the comparison with SARS is so important is that the coronavirus is a derivative of the SARS
100%.
virus. So it has like parallels, and it's very, very similar in nature. And so what we've seen is that as of time of recording, we've seen 17,205 infections in China itself, and as you mentioned, 361 deaths. And so if you work out that as percentage as to how many people are dying who get the disease, it's less deadly than SARS. And that's a little bit misleading because potentially it's less deadly because our medical intervention has been better than it was with the SARS virus. So we're not necessarily saying that the virus is less deadly, but we've contained it so far on a proportional basis to be less deadly. But the actual absolute numbers of people being infected is now bigger than the SARS virus. So that is quite worrying. I think that the medical interventions have been staggering. Chad, I don't know if you saw, but in the town of Wuhan where this kind of virus got kicked off, China are so desperate to contain it and trying to stop it in that little town. They went and built a fully fledged hospital in 6 days from nothing, from like foundations, from dirt to a fully fledged hospital in 6 days. And if you go and watch a time lapse of them building this, it's one of the most amazing videos you'll ever see. Kind of the feats of engineering, and it just shows you how good China are at developing things and building buildings and kind of getting this off the ground, plus how important it is to fix this as quickly as possible, that you can build a hospital in 6 days, which is absolutely nuts.
Absolutely amazing feat. I haven't watched a time lapse of it, but now that you mentioned there is one, I think as soon as we stop this episode, that's the first thing I'm going to do. Absolutely amazing. I think they built 2 hospitals in a short period of time. And it definitely is a sign of a country coming to the party when it's needed the most, which is good to see. Out of complete interest, Barry, did you know what corona actually means?
I don't. Educate me, Chad.
Well, yeah, here's a little bit of useless information. I believe it's derived from a Latin word where it essentially means crown. So I believe if you look at the biology of the virus itself and the family of viruses, like you mentioned, the SARS virus actually being part of the same family, there is a resemblance there to a crown. So that's what it means.
So it's not from the beer then, Chad?
No, it's not from the beer. They actually put out a statement on Twitter to say, nope, not us. But if you do look on their bottles, there is a crown. So quite interesting there as well.
Interesting.
So shall we move on to our next segment?
Let's do it.
Stuff I found interesting.
So I'm going to kick this one off with something I found interesting this week. Obviously, that's the title of this segment, so I don't even know why I said that. But this is essentially the question, and I suppose a debate that could be started, of can pseudoscience be dangerous? Now, like I've said in the previous few episodes, there's been a bit of a wellness month going on at the company that I've been working at it this past few months, and essentially they brought in a crystal healer to come in and do a talk, and this was kind of from the point of view of introducing a alternative form of therapy for potentially people who may be interested to find out more on a topic, and certainly not to push employees in the way of doing this. But one of the employees took quite negatively to this talk actually even happening in the building, and he essentially started this debate of can this type of pseudoscience actually be dangerous? He then linked in an article that is from Quora, where they basically draw comparisons to things like the law of attraction, where people kind of get taken away from doing sensible things because of this thinking that if I think positive, no matter what I actually do, good things are going to come to me. And so it basically started this debate of whether for mental health, pseudoscience can be dangerous, where crystal healing and sort of believing in these kinds of things can actually have a dangerous effect. Now, I thought it was really interesting because for me, I always subscribe to the idea that there are these various things in the world. People believe in what they believe in, and for some people it gives real benefits, and some people enjoy it. But for me, it's fairly easy to opt out if it's not for you. That's just my point of view. Barry, what is yours?
I've got some quite strong opinions on this. I think that when it comes to, first of all, pseudoscience is a very, very it's a term with a lot of baggage, right? There's a lot of connotation there, and so I don't necessarily want to use that in this discussion. I want to talk about just rational thinking. I think that a lack of rational thinking or scientific thinking is really the root of a lot of our problems we're seeing in society today. And when I say scientific, I'm not talking about like chemistry or anything you did at school. I'm just simply thinking about evidence-based decision-making, right? So looking objectively at a set of experiments that have delivered some evidence that have then kind of changed the way we think about a certain topic. And the more we move away from that kind of evidence-based decision-making to something more esoteric or something more like placebo-based or whatever the story is, such as crystals or those kinds of things, I worry that we lack our clarity in thinking and our ability to see objective truth in the world. So I firmly believe we all need to become more rational in the way we think and do our best to try and make decisions based on real evidence, and most importantly, be able to change our minds if the evidence changes, right? And that's kind of the crux of scientific or rational thinking. And so when we look at pseudoscience, which is normally things without evidence, and they're kind of believed when it comes to, there's a very charismatic leader who kind of talks about it a lot, or there's a big piece of media like the law of attraction or The Secret a few years ago, and it really kind of captures the audience who really wants help and really needs help. And so we chatted a few weeks ago about when you need help and someone is selling you that hope or selling you that solution that's going to solve all your problems, you obviously want to go along with it because you want to be better. You want those things to be solved. Sure. And in those instances, that's when you need scientific, rational thinking so that you make the right decisions. That being said, I also believe, which is kind of a discordant belief, that the placebo effect is incredibly important and incredibly powerful, right? And so for the people who believe in crystals, for example, I don't have any strong opinions. I never really looked into it that much. But for the people who really believe in it, if they believe in it so much that it kind of changes their mood and changes the way they look at the world and gives them some hope or some optimism or some kind of goodness or some sort of boost to their mental health, then I'm all for it. Like you said, if that's what gets you going and that's what helps you like move in this world and kind of get past all the obstacles in your way, then good for you. You must do it because the placebo is so important and so big and powerful. all I want to do is just caution you against making sure you don't just believe in something just because someone else told you to. So if you're going to go and experiment with something like The Secret or affirmations or crystals, go and experiment and do all your stuff, but actually be as rational and as skeptical as you can at first until it proves to you that it can work for you, and then go to the races. I think that everyone must do what's best for them, but when it comes to a macro perspective, when it comes to setting policies and laws and those sorts of things, we have to be using evidence-based decision making.
Yeah, it's a very interesting debate, and I think you hit the nail on the head on all points there. In terms of, at the beginning of your argument there, I thought you were going to kind of I thought you were going to kind of try and take people off of doing these things, even though it may work for some people. I've also never, experimented with crystals or anything like that. But, something like the law of attraction, I've seen examples in my own life where things happen. So I like you say, I definitely think everyone should kind of try things, but use rationality, use skepticism, and if it brings positive effects, then sure. I mean, when we talk about something like The Secret, we've had discussions which were surrounded by science, where you've mentioned like your thoughts are what you do. What you think is what you ultimately do. And even if you look at the sort of terrorist attack that happened today, it's kind of that same band where you surround yourself with people who are talking about this and this only, that becomes your reality. So I agree that there are some positive effects in thinking positively, but yeah, completely agree. I just think it's something that's out there. If you're keen, dabble in it. If you're not keen, I don't think you should take it away from the people who are enjoying real benefits from it.
Yeah, definitely. I think that it kind of comes back to our discussion on hypnosis last week about like self-hypnotization.
Yeah.
And that's what you're doing to yourself when you believe in these things, right? So when it comes to affirmations or positive reinforcement, what you're choosing to do, in essence, is look for the positive and look for the luck and look for the optimism in the world.
Yeah.
And by focusing on that only, it obviously will impact the way you think and therefore the way you act. But as long as you understand that's why you're doing it, you're not doing 100%. It because there's some magical force out there that's going to deliver you everything that you want, right? Sure. It's not about something esoteric or something out there. Sure. It's about understanding, how do I focus my energies on the right things that are going to bring the best results for me? So if a crystal is the best way for me to focus my energies and my thoughts and my attention on a certain thing that's really good for me, then that's great. As long as you understand that it's not the crystal that's doing that, it's you that is pushing that energy onto an object or a ritual or something like that is making that change. I don't think we're going to change minds or improve people's lives by trying to take away their crystals, right?
Yep.
I think the way we change lives is by helping them to think more clearly and more rationally about how to use these tools to improve their life, and not just believe in them because they have some sort of magical powers.
Completely agree, 100% there. Now, if we do move on to science and something that is more evidence-based, something I found quite interesting, we spoke about sleep in our first episode. We're 13 weeks later, and I'm still working through the book, but finding sort of nuggets of interesting information along the way, and that's the thing, this book kind of just, it's a gift that keeps on giving. And for me, which was really interesting, was the correlation, the scientific correlation between the number of heart attacks and accidents, motor vehicle accidents, the day after we are forced to lose an hour of sleep. So if you look at daylight savings, obviously in the UK, if you essentially the day we are forced to have 1 hour less of sleep correlated to all of the admissions in hospitals and all those types of things and accidents. That's an interesting correlation for me. And the other interesting piece is if you look at the inverse, i.e. when you gain an extra hour of sleep, the inverse correlation is true as well. You actually see a noted drop in heart attacks and drop in accidents, and with increased concentration and that kind of thing. Really fascinating for me, how we actually are forced by the changing of clocks to essentially change our biology and increase or decrease the risk of life.
It's such a beautiful natural experiment, right? In so much of science, we have to rely on these small sample sizes that are kind of biased because of the kind of people who would volunteer for these studies and whatnot, whereas daylight saving is a forced experiment on everybody in these regions. Yeah. And it happens every single year, and you can look at lots and lots of data which can pull these sort of insights. So it's a lovely national experiment, and it really does show the power of sleep, like you say. Sleep is so underrated, and the more we focus on it and the better we make it quality-wise, the better our lives, and we have to understand that.
100% agree there. Now, moving on to the next one, which is, I suppose, entertainment based. Obviously, you and I actually do have some downtime. And in that said downtime this past weekend, I watched a documentary of Taylor Swift. So she's released her Miss Americana documentary on Netflix. And for me, yeah, just fascinating to see some of the sort of clips I would have never come across. I'm sure the super fans would have not learned anything new. But for me, who just, hears her music on radio, I definitely gained some interesting insights out of her life. So she's had a truly incredible life. I think that's something to note, how she's kind of skyrocketed to fame at a really, really young age. So there's videos of her doing competitions and that kind of thing at sort of 13 years old. I think when Sony were sort of listening to her first recorded first recorded single, I think she was sort of around the age of 16, which is incredible to sort of get so big at such a young age. I mean, we spoke about Kanye West a while back, and that event has had a profound effect on her. So, where she has kind of built her whole life up on positive confirmation from those around her, that's where she kind of derived all of her value. When she was standing on that stage getting that award, and the crowd started booing, they were really booing at Kanye West, but for her, there wasn't that distinction. She kind of felt like a failure. She felt like people were booing for her. She kind of felt like she didn't deserve to be there. And that for me was really interesting. And naturally, her sort of mental health, I guess, took a bit of a dip after that.
Remind me what that event was, Chad. Am I correct in saying that Kanye West thought Beyonce should have won the award? Was that the story?
100%. So there you have Taylor Swift about to start her speech. In fact, I think she had started her speech, holding this award, looking at it, really a massive accomplishment for her, and something she'd been working as like a pinnacle to her, sort of rise. And there, Kanye West basically walks onto the stage, takes the microphone out of her hand, and says, congratulations, but Beyonce had a great video. And it was I suppose that moment that really started the scrutiny on Kanye West and the way he sort of conducts himself. I believe at that time he's said to have had bipolar, but I suppose looking back, there's all of those kinds of insights. Do you remember that moment, or was it something you missed?
It's very blurry in my memory. I do remember the uproar. I don't remember seeing the actual moment itself, but I remember the uproar after that and all the various back and forth. I didn't realize she took that much time off. That really shows how much of an impact it actually had on her. Like, she was in her prime. She was like right at the top of the world, one of the biggest pop stars in the world. To take that much time off is serious. So I think it's good that she's talking about these sorts of effects to try and bring some awareness to the fact that the perils of fame and what can happen in these mass media occurrences where you're up in front of the entire world and something like that happens to you. How do you deal with it? So interesting.
Yeah, 100%. And in terms of Barry's point of how long she took off, she took a full year off, where she kind of didn't show her face at all. No sort of public engagements, nothing. Which is, like you say, for someone in their prime, is definitely a significant effect. Then basically, sort of shortly after that, she was involved in a sexual assault case. She had brought about action in a sexual assault case where a guy, essentially on the red carpet, from what I can understand, put his hand up her skirt. There was a photo of the moment that this happened. There were sort of 7 witnesses, I believe. But for her, just the fact that she had to prove to a jury and that there was the possibility that somebody might not believe her was really something that resonated quite deeply within her and kind of got her thinking about all of the people who have these cases and don't get believed. And so I suppose she kind of, from then, it really sat quite deep within her. Now, in the end, the jury managed to rule in her favor, and she was sort of able to go on with her life. And I think it started picking up in velocity in terms of making new records and that kind of thing, until the Twitter mob, which previously never existed, decided that they all hated Taylor Swift, and it actually got to a global trending hashtag with obviously as many tweets detailing why they hated Taylor Swift. And I think the hashtag was something to the effect of, the Taylor show is over. So that naturally going to have an effect as well. I mean, we've certainly seen this in recent times. We spoke last week about cancel culture and that kind of thing. Why is a collective of people behind their computers able to have so much power over someone's life?
Yeah, it's one of the perils of modern fame, and it's kind of what social media has brought into this world. Is this idea that a mob mentality can kind of take hold of a cultural moment, and that hate can be so loud, right? So if you look at Taylor's career, she's got millions and millions and millions and millions of fans, but all it needs is 1,000 haters or 1,000 people who just have fun throwing shade at people. All it takes is them to be very, very loud, and they can really have an impact on the person they're trying to hurt, or kind of the cultural moment they're trying to hijack. And so I was actually reading a blog post by a guy called Tim Ferriss the other day, talking about the perils of fame and about how this is the major, like, empathetic and emotional struggle that these famous people go through. Is that regardless of how the numbers, so you have so many fans, your things are still selling, all of that stuff. Definitely. It's really hard to disregard that small minority that are very, very loud on social media and are saying horribly hurtful things about you. So how do you compartmentalize the fact that you are successful, you do have fans that love you, but unfortunately those fans are often a lot quieter than the people who are just throwing outrage at you. Definitely. It's one of the most difficult things that famous people must have to deal with, and for me it's a huge turnoff for when thinking about fame, right? It's one of those things that no one wants to deal with, and unfortunately it's part of the package, especially when you're at the kind of scale and kind of popularity that Taylor Swift is.
100%, and I think as these pop stars go on in life, they get better and better at this muscle. We spoke about sort of thoughts and behaviors and patterns as being muscles, and this is another one where you can sort of train yourself to not take as much notice of the negative sort of comments. And I mean, we've seen this on YouTube as well. We've seen this sort of everywhere, where you have trolls who feel empowered being behind a screen to say something that they potentially wouldn't have even said face to face. I would probably say 100% wouldn't have said face to face. And I think that's the real interesting and the real challenging thing here. Is that you've got a group of people who are empowered, and ultimately not much can stop them, which is definitely interesting. So essentially, the sort of next chain of progression, when she kind of picked herself up again after obviously getting better at this, is that she sort of started releasing some new music, and then started to have some very strong political views. And started actually voicing these political views, which is also interesting. So now in the music game, where sort of all of her producers and I suppose media managers and all of those kinds of people were asking her to be the good girl, don't say anything, don't sort of be anything, just be the good girl. She actually just thought for a second, no, for me not to say something is way worse. What could happen years down the line if I don't voice my opinion? And essentially, the results of that is the younger generation started voting. So there was a marked improvement in the voter turnout. And ultimately she didn't get the result that she was advocating for, but certainly an interesting wave. And we spoke about courage in terms of Mr. Phoenix and his speech for the BAFTAs, and it was exactly the same thing here, where she won, I think, a Grammy, and her closing speech was essentially saying, thanks for voting for me. This is something that I only got because people voted for, and there's something else that people vote for, and that's the elections, turnout, essentially, et cetera, et cetera. And it's kind of one of those where this taboo world of speaking out and having an opinion, she's sort of one of the advocates for breaking that down, and I think quite an important cause.
Yeah, very important. And she's such an important figure when it comes to female empowerment and gender equality and a lot of these kind of issues. And the fact that she is speaking up is very good. I mean, she obviously is very influential to a large group of the younger generation. And so the more she talks about these important issues and the more she kind of brings these to the surface, the better it is for society. So all props to her. May she continue to keep speaking her voice. Even if we don't like what she says all the time, the fact that she's actually bringing these topics up is more important. And so whether you like her or hate her, you have to admire her for, as you say, her courage and also her ability to make a mass movement like this and actually really influence on a masterful level. So yeah, all props to her.
Definitely. I mean, it's one of those where even if one lyric can sort of get a little thought going in your mind, it's certainly very powerful. I mean, there's a lyric that stuck with me in one of her last songs, "You Need to Calm Down." Now, I'm not sure if you've watched the music video, but it's a fantastic music video, very colorful. It's got she's got the Fab Five in there, really cool music video. But I think one of the closing lyrics to that song is "Shade never made anybody less gay." And that's such an interesting one. Whether your beliefs are for or against, the act of sort of belittling someone and bringing somebody down is not going to change fundamentally who they are. So why not just say nothing? And that for me is a great lyric, a great sort of wave of, I think, something that could become quite a powerful movement. So yeah, props to her, as you said. Now the next thing, I think Barry's obviously seen this one, but something I found interesting this week is having been in a public urinal, and the guy next to me was standing there with one hand on his cell phone, texting, actually physically texting. And obviously the other hand doing the business. Now for me, this was kind of just completely, way over the top. We're obviously crazy about our phones. We do some crazy things these days, like we were talking about screen on screen the other day, which is crazy in itself. But texting while at the urinal, one step too far, no?
Definitely. It's emblematic of the kind of the society we're living in at the moment. And the fact that our phones are glued to our hands, and there's no moment during the day where we are free from these devices. And until we are aware of this, until we become consciously aware of how much we're using our phones, we're going to see more and more of these situations, Chad, where it's completely ridiculous. I mean, the public urinal is the one place you should be focusing on your task at hand and not deferring your focus. And so it's crazy. I think that we all need to think very carefully about the amount we use our phones, and those little moments of theoretical boredom, or kind of in between, when you're walking between places or you're standing in a queue, or any of those times where we feel like we have the desire to pick up our phone. If we were just kind of present and kind of relaxed in that moment, and just kind of just sat there and stood there with our thoughts and just kind of rested for a little bit from all the inputs, I think it'd be good for us, right? The fact that we're getting inputs 24/7, like whether it's audio or text or video or whatever the story is, I think it's really powerful to have those moments of just stillness. So I hope we don't see as much of these in the future, but I fear that these are going to get worse and worse. It's up to us to look at our own phone habits and fix it for ourselves, I think.
Definitely. I mean, the first thing going through my mind is, what on earth could be that important? And secondly, surely, the fact that there's other people in this facility should make you think twice about taking out such a device. So yeah, completely agree with you there. Moving on to our next segment.
Looking ahead.
Right, so we've already touched on UK and their newfound confidence after coming out of the EU. And this last week we saw something else interesting. So Huawei have been set to be a threat in 5G networks by Donald Trump and the US, where he says that installing Huawei infrastructure could be opening the gates to Chinese spies and sort of making it easier for China to spy on what's happening in the country. And essentially, the UK has completely ignored what he's had to say. I believe there's a sort of body or sort of establishment wherein the UK shares intelligence with other nations, including Australia, Canada, and the US. And so by taking this stance, it's quite an interesting one in terms of what the other nations have to say on that front. But essentially they have put in some caps. So they've set a maximum cap of 35% of the total 5G infrastructure could be set out by Huawei. They've also set the type of infrastructure to the kind of non-core pieces. So if you look at like an antenna rather than a server, which is also interesting. I mean, does this do anything for the spying issue, do you think?
Yeah, that's why this story confuses me a bit. I think that I understand them wanting to do business with Huawei, right? So the first thing that's important to know is that Huawei are so far ahead when it comes to 5G infrastructure. So the technology is actually better than a lot of the Western kind of counterparts. And so for the UK, they obviously want this business and they want this technology in their country. So I understand their willingness to do business with them. But the risk is not the Huawei kind of takeover of the grid. It's the risk of spying, like we said. And so whether they have 1% or 99% of the technology, I would think that the spying issue is there, right? So this cap seems a bit arbitrary to me. I'm not sure what it's trying to accomplish other than diversifying risk and trying to allow for British counterparts to compete. But other than that, it kind of is a big like slap in the face to the US, because the US were very adamant that they wanted the UK to say no on a blanket basis as well. And so they are obviously very upset with this. And I've seen reports of them saying they might not even share intelligence anymore because they're worried it's going to be intercepted because the UK now has this infrastructure. So even though it's not going to be in the core areas and it's away from nuclear power plants and away from government facilities and all that stuff, the fact that it's there means that there's a risk. And so the question here is, do you trust Huawei to not be involved with the Chinese government? That's what it all comes down to, right? So obviously Huawei are saying that we're not involved, we would never do that, we would never give the government access, etc., etc. But as we know with China, the government has their fingers in every single pie. And so it's, do you trust that kind of separation or that Chinese wall? Excuse the pun, but like that's kind of the debate here. And so the 35% for me, Chad, feels arbitrary. I don't know what you think.
So that 35% is quite an interesting one, actually. I don't know the exact figure, but I believe there was a cap previously for Huawei, which was roughly, I think it was about a third. So this has actually given them a couple of extra percentage points to actually expand their presence a little bit more, which is interesting. And I think one of the other considerations here that is hard to ignore is that currently the 5G networks have obviously still developing, but there are currently 2 providers that are offering 5G in the UK. And I believe Huawei equipment has already been installed. So had the UK gone with the US's way, they would have had to sort of dismantle all of that stuff, obviously bring in alternate providers, which would sort of obviously increase the cost to the consumer. And so obviously Boris Johnson, one of his promises was obviously to focus on the internet, focus on networks. And for him, this obviously being a risk worthwhile taking, which is quite an interesting one. For me, I would rather, as the end consumer, have a cheaper and faster network system. I appreciate the risk mitigations in terms of the non-core pieces, and even if it may be arbitrary, I appreciate there being a cap to sort of make me feel a little bit better when going to sleep at night. What do you think?
Yeah, it's interesting. I'm not quite sure what to make of it. Obviously, there's huge concerns about China's behavior in these kind of debates. And time will tell what's going to happen, right? I find it interesting that this technological infrastructure kind of feels like the army bases of the 21st century, right? We're not installing army bases anymore. We're installing technology that's going to give us the opportunity to launch cyber warfare or to gain intelligence or any of these sorts of things. So who would have thought that a telephone tower would be such an important political and diplomatic piece of equipment in 2020, right? It's fascinating that that's how the world has evolved, where just that kind of technology is so important to a country's national security.
Definitely. I mean, I think the other thing that I forgot to mention as well, that I think is really hard to ignore, is obviously the UK are now looking at trade negotiations over the course of the year. Now, do they want to alienate China as an option? I certainly think that could be one of the reasons why they thought otherwise. But completely agree with you there. It's really interesting to see how the world of warfare has changed so much over these past few generations. Shall we move on to our next segment?
Yep, let's do it.
Develop and grow.
Right, so we're going to kick this one off with something that I experienced this past week, and it's kind of a humbling moment, really. So I threw myself in the fast lane in the swimming pool. I've registered for another half Ironman in line with the goals theme that we discussed last year. And so, yeah, basically thought, let me go into the fast lane. If anything is going to push me to work a little bit harder. And obviously from pushing boundaries, that's where growth happens. And so I actually ended up being in the lane with a dude who's superhuman. Well, either that or I'm just a terrible swimmer. But yeah, essentially I naturally had to swim a lot quicker just to kind of keep up. And essentially got kind of 800 meters into my workout where I had this kind of paralyzing calf spasm that, yeah, I've never had anything to this sort of magnitude before, where I had to actually physically stop and walk to the other side of the pool, trying to get this spasm to stop. And yeah, absolutely excruciating. And for me, it kind of just brought about this thought of, know your limits. Slow and steady wins the race. And I think I got ahead of myself there for a second. And yeah, just a humbling moment to bring me back down to earth.
There's nothing like those moments where your ego gets ahead of you and you think you can do more than you can do, right? And you see someone, and I don't know about you, Chad, but I'm super competitive, so I completely
100%.
understand that impulse. When I see someone like that, I'm like, I can match that. Of course I can, even if I've got no evidence to back that assumption up whatsoever. Kind of the parallel that I draw is that I run a park run every Saturday morning, which is a nice little 5K route.
Yeah.
And for some reason, there's this one little 11-year-old boy who beats me every week, and it gets to me so much. Because like even though I know that he's like super fast, he's got all the energy in the world, and of course it's okay that he's beating me. It's like it's not okay, and so I will push myself so hard to keep up with him, and then ruin the second half of my race because I'm not actually thinking carefully enough about it. So obviously there's a fine line. You always do want to be pushing yourself, and you want to be getting as good a workout as possible. But every now and then you do push too far because of ego. So while amusing, it's one of those things that happens in workouts. And as long as you're able to recover, Chad, that's all that matters.
Definitely. Managed to get out of it, thankfully. But I'm sort of scarred now. I can't see myself going back into the pool. So you're going to have to get over that emotional trauma, I guess. Now, tell us about what you discovered this week.
Sure thing. So I'm reading a book called The School of Life at the moment. So for the YouTube viewers, hopefully that's in focus. We'll find out later. So it's a great book, and we chat a lot about mental health on this podcast as one of our key topics, and this book is all about emotional health, exactly that. And it's been great so far. I'm about halfway through and really loving it. And one of the things I wanted to pull out for this week was a way to kind of mark yourself as to try and figure out how are you doing at the moment. So when we're trying to think about improving ourselves going forward, it's important that we know what our baseline is. It's important that we understand where we are today so that we can track our improvements and actually see that progress going forward. If you don't know where your baseline is and you've got this ideal, this goal you're trying to aim for, then it's very hard to understand, are you making progress along that journey? And so the baseline is important. And so in this book, he kind of pulls out 4 key almost I want to call them metrics for emotional health that kind of look at how are you doing right now, and therefore how can you improve. So Chad, I'm going to give you the 4 one by one, and we can do a comment on each one. So the first one is what he calls self-love. And the way he describes self-love is how much can we be friends with ourselves and remain on our own side. So I think this is interesting because it seems weird to be friends with yourself. A friend seems like it should be someone external to you. But I think why it resonates with me as a metaphor is that the way we treat our friends is often a lot better than the way we treat ourselves, right? With friends, we have empathy, we believe in them, we give them support, we kind of, if they do something wrong, we forgive them, etc., etc. With ourselves, we're often a lot more harsh. And so if thinking about being friends with ourselves and being on our own side is an important kind of part of self-love and self-care to ensure that our self-esteem is as high as it can be. Do you agree?
Absolutely agree there. I mean, our internal dialogue is key, and it's something we've already spoken about in this episode. So yeah, I mean, you're completely right. If I compare the way I treat a friend to the way I treat myself, even on silly things, if you fumble over something, if you do something silly, your immediate reaction is, "Oh, Chad, you're such an idiot." And sure, you may be, but 99% of the time you're just being too hard on yourself. And I think thinking of that as a marker will just bring attention to our sort of self-care and self-love. And I think it's something that we need to heighten our attention to.
Definitely. All right, part number 2 of the metrics is something called candor. And candor is the idea of what is the extent to which difficult ideas or troubling facts can be admitted into our minds, explored in a sober fashion, and then accepted without denial, right? So this is the idea of self-awareness and understanding difficult truths or difficult compromises that have been made, and can you actually look at them without denying them, right? And why this is so difficult is because we are amazing at deceiving ourselves, at deluding ourselves, at coming up with random rationalizations for decisions that we make. And the idea of candor is, how honest can we be with ourselves? Can you sit down and admit where you've got a flaw, or admit where you've got an insecurity, or admit where you need work? And the more honest you can be with yourself, the better chance you have of actually fixing it. Like with anything, if you're going to deny the problem, you're never going to get anywhere close to fixing it. So to be candid with oneself is a really, really key metric for mental health. Chad?
Yeah, I mean, this is kind of like our discussion about science, really. If we can put something over onto a stage and remove any sort of emotional attachments to it, evaluate it for its merits, that certainly opens the realm for possibility. And I think it's far too easy to lock and hold on to a position because it's what we know, it's what we've been brought up to believe. It's what our current frame of reference is showing. But yeah, opening ourselves up to the possibility of there being something different. And I think that's something that's important.
Definitely. All right, metric number 3 is that of communication. Now, the idea of communication is, can we patiently and reasonably put our disappointments into words that more or less enable others to see our point? So this kind of speaks to the fact that we often feel misunderstood as individuals, right? We have things inside of our head that we wish that someone could understand. And even people close to us, our partners, our family members, our friends, etc., we often feel misunderstood. And the ability to articulate something that someone else can understand with empathy, putting yourself in their shoes, trying to understand how they would look at that topic, that's a sign of emotional health. If you're unable to imagine what you need to say in order to get a message across to somebody else, you're often overthinking it, or you're in your own head, or you're not situated in the real world. And you're not understanding that communication is a sign of your lack of clarity in a way. So the clearer you're thinking, the more emotionally healthy you are, the better you are able to understand those disappointments and be able to talk about them in a reasonable way without getting super emotional or super all over the place. Chad?
Yeah, so quick thought that came to mind. Have you ever had a sort of set of circumstances where you have to tutor a friend on a new topic, and by the end of that experience, you find you actually have a deeper understanding of the subject matter yourself?
Definitely. And that's kind of the key point of this, is the fact that it's so easy to give advice, it's hard to take our own advice, right? So when we are communicating with a friend and talking through their issues and trying to understand what they're going through, it often forces us to get some clarity on what we think and what we think the best course of action is. And so it's so easy to give advice to other people. It's so hard to actually listen to your own advice.
Yeah.
And so that communication is very important. And I agree with you, Chad. Talking it through and being able to communicate it in a clear way is the first step to understanding what you're going through, to understanding that disappointment and putting it in the right context. And we have to be social creatures, right? We can't do it on ourselves, by ourselves, right? We can't just live in our own heads the whole time. We have to be social and be able to share this with people that care about us. And so communication is very, very important there.
Yeah, I mean, I think for me, the important piece of this is the patient and reasonable bit. I mean, that straight away takes away all irrationality. It takes away, emotional connotations in sort of the inferences we make in our tonality and the way we speak. And by doing it patiently and reasonably, it is essentially making sure that we ourselves are actually hearing what's coming out of our mouths and are actually forcing ourselves to think with that kind of way of speaking, if that makes any sense. So what's the next one?
Yeah, so the last metric is what's called trust. And I really like the way he writes about this, so I'm going to read it word for word. He says, how readily might we survive a challenge in the form of a speech we must give, or a romantic rejection, or a bout of financial trouble, a journey to another country, or even a common cold? How resilient are we? Right? And so this is talking to, do we trust ourselves that if we make a mistake, if we fall down, if we do something wrong, how do we get it back up? Do we have that resilience to understand that even if I make a mistake, I believe in myself that I'm going to be able to get back up and rebuild, right? And that trust comes from experimenting. That trust comes from doing it and failing and failing and failing and failing and proving to yourself that you can do it. So when you don't have trust in yourself, you're not going to take any risks. You're going to stay nicely inside your comfort zone. You're going to do exactly what you've always done. You're never going to change anything because it's too risky to go and try something new in case you fail. Right? So the more trust you can build with yourself and understand that you are strong and resilient, the more emotionally healthy you are, and the better suited you are to getting past life's obstacles. Any thoughts, Chad?
Yeah, I mean, I like it. I do like it, but I also don't like it. And I'll tell you why.
Tell me.
In terms of this idea of resilience, I think for me and even my sort of internal dialogue, I think that if I can stick something out for a period of time, I'm resilient. That's a marker of approval. It's a positive thing. But I mean, sometimes it's okay to fail. Sometimes it's okay to not be resilient. And so for me, I just worry that it encourages us, kind of like guys crying, for example, kind of like that whole stigma. It kind of encourages us to want to be resilient when we are actually entitled to not be, if that makes any sense.
That's an interesting point. I didn't think about it like that. I think that when I'm using the word resilience here, I'm talking about the fact that we can go into those depths, so those
Yeah.
dark moments, and actually feel those feelings, and have the kind of confidence we're going to get out of those situations.
Definitely.
So I think what you're saying is right. Like it's not about being resilient immediately. It's not about being resilient in the fact that we can never feel sad or never feel upset or never feel
Yeah.
like we've done a bad thing. It's about knowing that even in the depths of those dark moments, we have the ability to stand up once again.
Yeah.
Right. And so we've spoken a lot about this before, especially from a male perspective, is actually feeling those emotions and actually going through it, not trying to sweep it under the rug, but going through that sadness, going through those tough times, but understanding that you don't have to live there forever. Once you've done that grieving, you've done that work, you've got through that hurt, you've processed that emotion, you know that you can stand back up again.
Definitely.
But yeah, great point, Chad.
Yeah, I mean, I can definitely see how knowing your ability to, come back from something that's, adverse or something bad that happened, I can definitely see how just knowing that you're able to bounce back, could give you some mental clarity and be a positive indicator for mental health. But yeah, glad we kind of spoke to both sides of that argument. Shall we move on to a question from our listener?
Definitely.
What's on your mind?
Alrighty, so this week we have a question again from a listener. Thanks again for your question, Michaela. Let's have a listen.
Hey guys, thanks for a great podcast. This is a question from a fellow South African and bookworm, and just a thought on our society going digital and paperless. Are books and buying books and bookstores going to become obsolete? I'd love your thoughts on that. And now that everything is online and accessible online, when last did you actually go and buy a book? Something to think about. Thanks so much, guys.
I kind of already know the answer to this question, and all of our YouTube viewers know the answer to this question. But anyway, let's do it. Barry, when was the last time you bought a book?
Oh, Chad, I bought a book yesterday, of course. Of course I bought a book yesterday. There are a few things that I'm more passionate about than physical books, right? And so you have to take everything I say with a pinch of salt. It's almost a religious feeling when it comes to books. Michaela's a great question, and it's something that really saddens me is that I'm seeing that decline of physical bookstores, of people reading physical books, because people are moving to Kindles, or even more scarily, moving to their phones or moving to Twitter and those sorts of things. I mean, reading less books in general. And so that definitely is a trend, and it's a worrying trend for me. I really believe in the power of books. I think that books are one of the most amazing technologies we've ever invented. And when it comes to knowledge acquisition, when it comes to escapism, when it comes to learning about ourselves, I think that books are the best tool for that. Personally, I buy all my books in physical formats because I like the feeling of it, and I like the smell, and I like having it on my shelf. And I have this dream, Chad, one day of having one of those Harry Potter libraries with just like a ceiling to floor shelves with that the kind of the red velvet carpets and a nice armchair and the ladder going around. And so I'm busy building my physical library right now, and I buy books as much as I can. It's one of those things where I don't feel guilty about spending money on books. That's the one category of my spending that I'm willing to spend as much money as I want. So when I see a book that I want, I don't even think about it, I just buy it. Because books have impacted my life so much, and I think they're such an important piece of who I am, and they've kind of made me the person that I am. And that's why they're so important to me. When it comes to the physical versus the digital thing, I obviously am very romantic about physical books, but I don't want to push that on anyone else, right? The Kindle's an amazing piece of technology, and the fact that it's portable and the fact that it's light and it works and you don't have to lug around big, heavy books is amazing, and it's often made people read more in certain circumstances. So for me, it's not about whether it's physical or digital. The issue is please read more books. That's what's important. Whether you like the physical stuff or the digital doesn't really matter. The reason I like physical is because there's so many screens in my life already. Right, so when I sit down in a book for an hour, I'm getting away from every other screen. The Kindle's to me is just another screen. Even though the e-ink's a little bit different, and it's not as hard on the eyes, and it seems a little bit different. For me, being able to retreat to a couch with a nice cup of coffee or a glass of water and reading a book for an hour or two really helps me just get away from the rest of the world. What do you think, Chad?
Yeah, I agree. I think it's a good question, and I mean, I think why it's a good question is if we look at how CDs have changed, how DVDs have changed. We kind of just rent something on an Apple TV. In terms of music, we listen to it on a streaming service, and so there is that natural question of what happens with a physical book. But it is different because with a CD, there's no way of me picking up the CD and with my eyes scanning the contents of that CD. It's kind of how I'm really interacting with that physical media, and that's what's changed. Whereas with the book, you can use a book as a book. You don't need some other thing to interpret what it's saying, and so that's why I think it has sort of stood the test of time up till now, at least. But it certainly is an interesting one. So on my front, I have the last few books that I've picked up and kind of am halfway through. Is a bit of a mix, really. So I've got, I think, 4 books that I'm yet to read in physical form. And then I have one that is on my phone in the Kindle app, which is, at any given time able to read. And I like having both because if I am in a case where I didn't envisage myself to have any spare time, I can now just pull out my phone or my iPad that's already there with me for whatever purpose, and I can read a book, which I think is useful. Like you said with the Kindle, I think why it's so powerful is because of this e-ink screen, and I haven't got one yet, but I certainly think once I get one, which I think is an inevitability, I think it's going to be interesting to see how my opinion changes there. It is the glare of the phone and is the glare of the iPad and the bright light that emits from behind it that for me has kind of got me a bit cautionary, and I sort of use it, on and off. I'd much rather spend more time with a book on a physical piece of paper. But yeah, certainly once I give a Kindle a go, it's going to be an interesting transition. I mean, I'd be fascinated to hear what our listeners think on this. So yeah, do let us know where you sit on that piece of the debate. So yeah, Barry, good to learn a bit more about the things you care most about in the world. And I think a pretty great episode.
I think so too. It lucky number 13, as we like to say. It's been a good episode, lots of good stuff. We're really enjoying the feedback. We've seen a big growth in the last kind of week or two. And a big reminder, we've recently launched our Facebook page for the podcast. So we've had a few people saying, it's a little bit long for us. The podcast's going too long. Don't worry, we've got you covered. We've been clipping out individual pieces of the episode and putting it on our YouTube Clips channel and now on our new Facebook page. And so if you don't want to commit to a full hour and a half podcast right now, go and test out some of our clips. Try and pick a topic that matters to you or that looks interesting to you and get a sense of what we're doing. That Facebook page will be updated continually. So if you're on Facebook, it's a much better use of your time than scrolling through other people's wedding photos and engagement shoots and all that good stuff.
Yeah.
Hopefully you'll learn something. And I really enjoyed this one, Chad. So thank you.
Absolutely. And more importantly, if you're on that Facebook page, please send us a message. I think a lot of the time we're just kind of churning out content and anecdotally hearing back a few things about each episode, but we want to engage, and we want to turn this into a two-sided conversation. So if you are there, certainly stop in and watch all the videos you can, but also let us know your thoughts, and if there's something you'd like us to chat about, that would be great as well. If you are listening just on one of our podcast apps, please do hit subscribe or follow depending on which one you're on, and we'll see you soon. This was episode 13 of Across the Pond.
Pond, across the pond with Barry and Chad.
Lucky number 13. Let's go.
Lucky number 13. Oh, why did you say that? Now you're gonna give me a complex there, Barry.
It's my favorite number. Don't worry about it.
Or is this actually sort of putting
Crime? What was it? A security company called what's the name of a security company?
ADT?
Yeah.
What's the word now? An artificial vest, not artificial. Sorry, what's the right word for this? For these fake vests? Just a fake vest.
A fake vest, yeah.
Yeah. It's a resounding.
Like public.
Playing Julie Garland in Judy, and I actually, sorry, did I say Julie or Judy?
Is it Judy?
Is it Judy or Julie?
I don't know. I've never heard of that either.
Sorry, let me quickly. Julie. Oh, that's July. we spoke about a stat that I heard on, or not a stat, but it's kind of previously been seen. Out of interest, are there? Sorry, I said interest way too many times. How can I even rescue that? Introducing an alternative theory. Sorry. This one, I suppose, on the entertain. Why is this? Oh, sorry. I don't know why I thought we were still in the week that was, and I was like, what? Sorry, let me start again. Started the what's the word?
Definitely, it's emblematic. It's emblematic.
I'm sort of what's the word? I saw Barry was ready to go at the response. Oh, where's the button?
Hey guys, thanks for a great
Wall to floor.
Anecdotally, sorry. That was solid.
That felt much better. The conversation
Much
was
better.
much. Dude, I talked about the wildlife last time. I've seen, I kid you not, 7 different species of bugs. Not even just bugs. There was a ladybird, there was a little green dude, there was a moth, there was a mosquito. It's like a whole biodiverse ecosystem that are loving this light.